Lately, I've been reflecting a lot on the topic of truthfulness. This is a complex topic that people throughout time have thought long and hard about. In some cases, deep reflection on this topic has led to fantastic progress and lasting advancement for all humankind. In the other cases, it can be led astray and led to perversion. So, the first thing I've been reflecting on is what is it that sometimes makes this process go well, and what is it that sometimes leads it astray? While there are a number of logical fallacies that lead people to fall into the trappings of the latter, often it really begins with some form of selection bias. This is an inherent challenge for all human beings that we all struggle with on some level. In professional environments, it's widely recognized how absolutely critical it is to protect our thinking against selection bias. Successful enterprises all structure themselves with explicit and methodical procedures for detecting and rectifying selection biases. You can pause this video if you want to read a good example of how important that is. However, selection bias is a human struggle that invades every part of our lives. It distorts our understanding of reality, both breeding all sorts of other logical fallacies, and itself distorting our ability to live truthfully. Ultimately, it creates a bubble around us that essentially imprisons us in our own alternate reality and circumscribes how much we can grow. Instead, we get more and more angry and complain about people living in a different reality from us, while becoming less and less willing to engage in a dialogue that could help us discover truth about our own trappings. So, rather than just the small group of people I'd normally get together to study topics like truthfulness and honesty with, I wanted to welcome anyone in my Facebook friends list to send me a voicemail message on how you go about ensuring you live your life as truthfully as you hope to. Even if you have just one sentence to say on what truthfulness is to you, send me a voicemail. The most difficult part of thinking about truthfulness often comes down to establishing just what is truth. In this comic that circulates Facebook, it has two people arguing over a number, whether it's a 6 or a 9, explaining that the two parties simply need to see life from the other side. Whereas this response comic points out that, as convenient and tempting as it may be to say that they're both right, that's not always the case. It states that one of these people is indeed correct and one is wrong. If they were to take the time to back up, orient themselves, see if there are other numbers to align with, or maybe a driveway or a building to face, or somebody who actually knows they could ask, they could determine which is actually true. Both of these views come from a good place. There are indeed situations where we need to learn to see life from the other person's perspective and not get caught up in being needlessly judgmental. And there are indeed times when we need to double down on our effort to explore together what might be able to help us orient ourselves to becoming more truthful. The reason the discussion in these comics is so powerful is because it's a natural human tendency for us to approach both of these situations in the wrong way. Sometimes, what we need to do is take more time to see another person's perspective in order to understand the larger truth, but we avoid doing so by claiming the other person is just too ignorant to be worth wasting our time on because we believe our perspective is infallible already. We're not even willing to put forth our perspective in a way that gives it a chance to be challenged. Whereas sometimes we hide behind non-confrontation and tolerance when actually we just don't want to go through the effort of consulting or exploring truth. When we're just not willing to discuss our objective rationales to our understanding of the world, when we're comfortable with the bubbles we've constructed to protect ourselves. In both cases, the more destructive path is the easier and more natural one to take, the one inertia will push us to if we don't actively think about it. So, what tools do we have for taking the best from both of these approaches instead of the worst? Throughout the ages, religion, science, and philosophy have at their hearts been the core tools human beings have used to uncover truth. Sure, you can always come up with countless examples of cases where various individuals have perverted any of these three disciplines and exposed the worst sides of humanity. But at their original source, at their core, each of these were originally designed as key paths to truthfulness, each designed to complement the other. Each, at their source, being a mechanism to practice logic. For example, we've already talked about selection biases and how destructive it can be to truthfulness. Each of these disciplines warns extensively about selection biases, even if some people in history have subsequently acted in the exact opposite way. They also warn about a number of other logical fallacies and cognitive biases. Each of these have been recognized since the dawn of history as core human tendencies that pull us away from recognizing truth. There's no shortage of YouTube videos out there with lots of great examples describing each of these, but there are a few of them I'm seeing constantly in my Facebook feed. The most common is the straw man fallacy, or the related composition fallacy. These are fallacies we find it incredibly easy to spot when other people are doing it to us, or something we agree with. Yet people tend to be really blind as to how often they commit composition fallacies themselves. Many people probably studied these fallacies in school. Perhaps you had them all memorized at one point. The key question we need to ask ourselves as adults is how do we actually apply them? What is the illusion of truth that makes logical fallacies so seductive, and what practices do we need to implement in our lives in order to avoid circumscribing our growth? In other words, how do we identify when we're drifting from truthfulness, and what do we do about it? Historically, one practice that did this was the practice of confession, because at its core, setting aside a time which we need to articulate what actions we think we should have done differently requires us to reflect deeply on what we need to do to be truthful ourselves. Of course, over time, this practice began to take many different forms, some of which are extremely controversial and easy to see the pitfalls of. However, as discussed earlier, arguing against a practice as a whole by focusing on the most controversial implementation of it is itself a dangerous logical fallacy. Instead, we need to look at the strongest form of an argument when evaluating it as a whole. And I think there can actually be tremendous value in something as simple as setting aside a short period of reflection each day to identify which of our actions make us more truthful and which of our actions are rooted in logical fallacies. For example, let's say during the day I was taking care of two kids, and they began to argue over whose turn it was to clean up. I told them, I don't want to hear any more of this. Timmy, you clean up this half of the room, and John, you clean up the other half of the room. In the moment, I may feel like that was a reasonable action to have taken. In the evening, I reflect on my actions during the day and take account of them. Did I really take that action because it was the most just? Or because it was all I had the patience for dealing with? What are the consequences of my not trying to investigate the full picture? Why didn't I ask questions like, okay, well, who actually made this mess and who cleaned up the room previously and what's the schedule or any other objective criteria for determining who should clean it at that point? Essentially, my actions were teaching the kids that if they make a truthful argument at the beginning, they ultimately will suffer for it. Even though little Timmy fully deserves a 6, he receives a 7.5, as that's the middle ground between a 6 and a 9. He'll learn that if he wants to do well, he needs to start his positions with something untrue, so that people will compromise on what he actually deserves. Or perhaps he'll learn he can game the system to his advantage by just dissociating from truth as much as possible. As an adult, then, he'll get outraged if people start to examine him truthfully. He'll complain about how unfair the world is to him and how nobody else has learned to compromise. And when we get to adult interactions, it becomes even more imperative that we take the time to reflect on how our actions align or don't with our understanding of truthfulness, particularly when we end up in conversations, when we're discussing something with somebody who isn't present in that conversation. This is difficult because people don't often expect objectivity in these spaces. If they're accustomed to safety bubbles, they'll become enraged if challenged in such an environment. And this is a natural human reaction that has led people away from truthfulness since the dawn of time. And since the dawn of time, essentially every spiritual tradition throughout history has implored its followers to reflect deeply on their participation in whispers, gossiping, backbiting, or other practices that are common when we retreat from direct discussions. You can pause this video to read more about any of these. All of them, though, point to how important it is for us to reflect deeply on our participation in gossip and backbiting. These situations can be tempting because, at no cost to ourselves, we can score quick and easy appreciation from the person we're talking to. We feel validated by our ability to bring a temporary and superficial happiness to someone. We love when they tell us how good they feel talking to us. Similar to when we offer a child a special treat, we receive temporary admiration. Although, in this situation, we can often recognize the importance of thinking about the larger long-term picture and why other actions might be better. Similarly, when we participate in adult conversations, we need to reflect deeply. Are we letting a person's immediate response dictate our actions? Or are we truly trying to create discussion focused ultimately on achieving truthfulness? Unfortunately, many forums simply don't offer the space for people to really explore truth together. They allow for easy discussion with points you already agree with, but make productive discussion difficult when you don't. In these cases, we need to be truthful to ourselves. Are we participating at all because we think we're bringing the discussion closer to truthfulness? Or because we want to feel better ourselves by venting anger? If it's the latter, are there other topics we could pick that would help develop everyone's critical thinking skills generally, instead that do fit into that space? And if that's not possible, are there other approaches to explore, other forums that are more worthy of our time? Rather than ridiculing someone's belief, could we perhaps resolve our differences by going to their source and figuring out how that can actually lead both of us to truth? Ultimately, a space for reflection on why we're using our time to engage in particular practices can go a long way. At its core, it comes down to our worldview and how we want to spend our time. For better or for worse, when we scroll through our newsfeed, we can get the impression that the fate of the world is shaped exclusively through the actions of a few powerful men, and the most we can do is complain and comment about it. If you believe this is the only path to change, then spending your life like this makes perfect sense. If, however, we believe there are other possible paths to change out there, it behooves us to reflect deeply on the true impacts of our actions and all the different actions we can take, to think about how we can act with love and kindness, but also be firm and truthful. As you've seen for me, this involves setting aside time to reflect systematically each day on essentially the golden rule, as well as a number of other, more specific instances of it that I study with friends. But I'm curious, how do my other Facebook friends go about ensuring that you guys don't get trapped in artificial safety bubbles? What practices do you incorporate into your life? I'd love it if you could send me a voicemail message on how you go about ensuring you live your life as truthfully as you hope to, and what that means to you.